Under the pale dawn of an Alaskan spring, Margaret Reed stepped out of her small cabin and took a deep breath of the fresh air. The snow was melting, revealing patches of muddy earth and wildflowers just emerging from beneath the ice. She listened to the first sounds of life reborn after the long winter, the chirping of sparrows, the trickling of water from a nearby stream. But then, amidst this symphony of life, another sound reached her ears. Weak, desperate. It was the cry of a creature in pain. Margaret stopped, frowning. Years of living alone in the wilderness had taught her that a sound like that rarely signaled anything good. She grabbed her old hunting rifle, donned her fur coat, and slowly made her way toward the forest. The cry seemed to echo from a distance, growing louder with each step, compelling her to follow. Crossing moss-covered pine trees, Margaret discovered a heartbreaking sight. A mother bear lying helpless on the ground, breathing heavily, her dark eyes glinting with pain. One of her front legs was caught in a metal trap, the wound so deep that the blood had dried in dark streaks on the snow. But what shocked Margaret even more was the sight of 3 tiny bear cubs curled up beside their mother, weak and shivering in the cold. One of them bore a strange mark on its chest, a small heart-shaped scar, standing out against its soft, light brown fur. Margaret knelt, observing cautiously. She knew the dangers of interfering with nature, especially when it came to bears. But the mother's eyes, no anger, no threat, only silent pleading, caused her heart to ache. Those eyes reminded her of the final moments with her own husband when he passed away in silence, leaving her alone with an endless emptiness. With the patience of someone who had lived through many trials, Margaret set about trying to release the trap. She understood that if she didn't help the mother bear, it would have no chance of surviving. But even as the trap was freed, the wound was too severe. The mother bear tried to move, but then slumped, her eyes slowly closing as a weak breath escaped her before her large body became completely still. Margaret didn't leave immediately. She sat there, watching as the 3 cubs huddled around their mother, their round eyes wide and confused by the sudden loss. One of the cubs, the one with the heart-shaped mark, looked up at her. In that moment, Margaret felt something strange, an inexplicable connection. She knew she couldn't leave them. These 3 tiny lives, without their mother, would not survive in the harsh wilderness. But taking them back to her cabin meant putting herself at risk. They were wild animals, and although their instincts were still immature, they could become dangerous as they grew. Margaret slowly extended her hand. The cubs recoiled in fear, but hunger and cold had drained their strength. After a moment's hesitation, she gently picked them up one by one, cradling them in her arms. They were smaller than she expected, their soft fur and shiny black eyes glowing in the dim light of the forest. Margaret wrapped them in her thick coat, feeling their warmth against her chest. She didn't look back as she walked away, leaving the mother bear behind, still and silent in the snow. She knew that this choice could bring countless problems, but her heart wouldn't allow her to do otherwise. When she returned to the cabin, Margaret placed the cubs on a fur blanket near the stove. They were still trembling, clinging to each other, but their hunger made them cry weakly. What should she do now? What could she feed them? She had never raised bear cubs before, but she knew they needed milk and warmth. Rummaging through her small kitchen, she found some goat's milk she had kept for herself. She poured it into a small bowl, dipped a piece of soft cloth into it, and gently placed it into the mouth of one of the cubs. At first, it resisted, but soon, instinct took over, and it began to drink. Little by little, the other 2 watched, their wide eyes full of suspicion, but eventually, they accepted the milk as well. Margaret sat beside them, silently watching. In the pale light of the stove, these tiny creatures felt like a miracle in the midst of her solitary life. They were part of nature, yet also a part of the loneliness she had lived with for years. A part of her whispered that this was only temporary, that when spring arrived, when they were strong enough to survive on their own, she would have to return them to the wild. But another, deeper part of her, couldn't help but feel something greater, an undeniable connection. The heart-shaped mark on the cub's chest glistened in the firelight, like a mysterious sign of fate. Margaret gently touched it, whispering words she didn't quite understand. "We'll be all right, won't we?" The three cubs huddled close to her, their breathing soft and steady. And in the quiet of the wilderness night, Margaret knew that her life had just entered a new chapter, a chapter full of risk, but also overflowing with hope. Margaret's life had completely changed since the three bear cubs came to live with her. For a woman who had lived alone for so many years, becoming the mother of three tiny creatures was something she had never imagined. She named them Willow, Aspen, and Spirit. Each name held its own significance, symbolizing the distinct characteristics and personalities of each bear cub. Willow was the curious one, always exploring and trying to discover the world around her. Whenever Margaret opened the door, Willow would race out, her bright eyes shining, eager to explore everything. She never stopped being curious, wanting to understand each branch, every bird flying by, or even the tiny footprints in the snow. Aspen, with her strong and sturdy body, had a tendency to protect her siblings. Whenever they found themselves in an unexpected situation, Aspen would rush in to protect Willow and Spirit, sometimes with a force that surprised Margaret. She was a model of resilience, always finding a way to stand up despite the challenges. Margaret always felt safe and reassured with Aspen by her side. Spirit, the cub with the heart-shaped mark, was completely different. She was the quietest of the three, always sitting still, observing everything around her. But what was special about Spirit was her eyes. They always carried an intelligence, as if she understood Margaret's emotions. Whenever Margaret was feeling sad, Spirit would approach and gently lean against her as a silent comfort. Margaret felt a strange connection with Spirit, as if she was the only companion she had been waiting for during all those years of solitude. Margaret spent all her time caring for the three cubs. Every day, she prepared food for them, cleaned their fur, and taught them basic habits. Her life was no longer dull and lonely. She not only had a family, but also beings who depended on her. She began to feel the joy of motherhood. Every time she saw the three cubs playing together in the yard, her heart would swell with happiness. Though life was not easy, she felt that the hardships were small compared to the love she received from them. However, Margaret's new life was not always peaceful. One day, while she was walking the three cubs in the forest near her home, a game warden appeared. He was a middle-aged man with a stern face and sharp eyes. Margaret couldn't help but feel nervous as he approached. "Hello, ma'am. I'm the game warden for this area," he said, his tone serious. "We've received information that you are keeping wild animals. I want to remind you that keeping bears is illegal." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She had known that keeping bears was illegal, but she never imagined that it would cause trouble for her. She tried to stay calm and explained, "But, sir, these bears are orphaned. I can't leave them in the forest. They won't survive." The warden looked at her with cold eyes. "I understand, but that's not a valid excuse. Bears are wild animals and need to live naturally in their environment. Keeping them is not only illegal, but could also pose a danger to both you and those around you." Margaret felt as though her heart was breaking. She couldn't imagine one day having to return the cubs to the wild, where they would face dangers they had never known. But she also knew that she couldn't ignore the law. That evening, when the three cubs had fallen asleep in the warm cabin, Margaret sat alone by the fire, contemplating the future. She couldn't let the cubs return to the wild, but she also couldn't continue living in this illegal situation. She decided she had to find a way to legalize her right to care for them. She began searching for information about animal protection organizations, trying to find a way to protect the three cubs without facing harsh penalties. But the more she searched, the more she realized that legalizing her care for the cubs was nearly impossible. According to the regulations, wild bears could not be kept as pets, even for humanitarian reasons or out of love. Furthermore, caring for them in an artificial environment could have unforeseen impacts on both the cubs and herself. Still, Margaret didn't give up. She decided to meet with wildlife experts, seeking their help in applying for a special permit. She knew this would be a tough battle, but she had no other choice. The maternal love she had for the 3 cubs was something she could not change, no matter what she had to sacrifice. With a small but unwavering hope, Margaret continued her journey, not only to protect the 3 cubs but also to protect a love that she never thought she would find. Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of anxiety as she faced the legal battle to protect the 3 bear cubs. But the one thing she knew for sure was that she could not abandon them. Willow, Aspen, and Spirit had become an irreplaceable part of her life. These small creatures bringing warmth, joy, and love that she hadn't felt in years. The bond between her and the 3 cubs could not easily be shattered by cold laws. After her meeting with the game warden, Margaret understood that she needed to act quickly if she didn't want to lose her adopted children. However, she also realized that merely going to animal protection organizations and hoping for their help was not enough. She needed to draw public attention, to make her story a symbol of love and compassion for wild animals. And so, she decided to bring her story to the press. Margaret called a few local journalists and told them about the 3 bear cubs she was raising. At first, it seemed like her story only attracted the attention of a few people. But then, as the articles were published, their reach steadily grew. Other reporters began to contact her, and her story appeared in major newspapers, particularly when her story was widely shared on social media. Animal lovers from all over the world began to voice their support. The online community exploded with calls to protect the 3 cubs, sharing similar stories about raising wild animals, and encouraging Margaret to continue her fight. Animal lovers from all over sent letters, messages, and even donated money to help her with the legal battle. They organized online campaigns, urging authorities to create exceptions in the law to allow her to raise the 3 cubs, seeing it as a unique situation that the legal system should be flexible about. The pressure from public opinion grew so strong that the authorities could no longer ignore Margaret's story. Meetings were held, and experts in wildlife and law began to reconsider her case. The government could not overlook the powerful pressure from the community. Animal protection organizations and NGOs, they were forced to consider Margaret's case as an exception and make a decision. One autumn day, when golden leaves began to fall along the village roads, Margaret received a call she had been waiting for. It was from the Wildlife Management Agency. The representative informed her that, after considering the special circumstances of her case, they had decided to grant her a special permit to continue raising the 3 cubs. However, to ensure the safety of both the cubs and herself, she would need to comply with strict regulations regarding their living environment, diet, and care. She would also have to work closely with a wildlife expert who would supervise and advise her on caring for these wild creatures. Margaret couldn't contain her joy when she heard the news. A sense of relief flooded her heart. But she also understood that this was only the first step. She would have to continue working with experts, adhering to strict requirements, and ensuring the cubs could live in a safe and suitable environment. However, she knew that this was a victory not only for her but also for animal lovers and those who believed that compassion could change the world. The government's recognition was not just about issuing a permit. Margaret's story had become a powerful symbol of compassion and the love between humans and nature. Her story proved that, in a world full of dry rules, sometimes kindness and love could create unexpected changes. She wasn't just raising 3 bear cubs. She was nurturing a belief that humans could live in harmony with nature, that we could create a world where all living beings could exist, grow, and find protection. Margaret's story was also a reminder of the power of community. It was the collective support, the backing of animal lovers, and the sharing of her story on social media that created a powerful wave that forced the authorities to listen. It was proof that when compassionate people stand up, they can create real change. With the permit in hand, Margaret continued to care for the 3 cubs, and her life was no longer just a solitary story. She became a symbol of courage, persistence, and unconditional love. In the following months, her story continued to be told, inspiring those who believed in the power of love and compassion. Margaret knew that, although many challenges lay ahead, she had won a great battle, the battle to protect her family and the values she believed in. Winter had arrived once again in Alaska, and with it came the blinding snowstorms, erasing all traces of life on the ground. Margaret continued her peaceful life with the 3 bear cubs, but she sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Spirit, the cub with the heart-shaped mark, had started to behave oddly. Throughout the fall, Margaret had noticed that Spirit seemed particularly drawn to the natural world. It often looked up, watching the birds soaring high, the herds of deer running by, and most importantly, the wild bear families it could spot from a distance through the misty woods. Willow and Aspen remained deeply bonded with Margaret, always close by, seeking comfort and protection from her gentle hands. But Spirit, with its quiet nature and deep eyes, seemed to grow increasingly distant from life inside the cabin. Though Margaret loved it as her own, and Spirit had spent much precious time by her side, she felt that something was changing within the cub. Sometimes, when she looked into its eyes, she saw a longing, a desire to return to where it truly belonged, the deep forest. Then one day, as the snowstorms once again enveloped the cabin, Spirit disappeared. Margaret didn't notice its absence right away, but when she searched the house and called its name without receiving a response, a wave of anxiety washed over her. She stepped outside, trudging through the thick snow and sparse woods. The storm raged on, the snow falling like white curtains, but she couldn't leave Spirit alone in the biting winds. It was a formidable challenge. But Margaret didn't hesitate. She had become accustomed to solitude. But she couldn't let Spirit, part of her family, disappear. The entire day passed as Margaret searched tirelessly. She crossed frozen streams, climbed snow-covered rocks, and called Spirit's name into the howling winds. But there was no sign of Spirit nearby. Despair began to rise within her. Had it gotten lost in the deep forest or encountered danger? She remembered the time Spirit had sat silently, gazing toward the woods, its eyes full of contemplation and unease. It was ready for something greater, something Margaret couldn't provide: freedom. After hours of searching, just when Margaret was almost losing hope, she unexpectedly spotted a trace in the snow, a set of bear tracks. But not from an ordinary bear. These were the tracks of a large bear. And what horrified Margaret was that within those tracks were the traces of Spirit's own paw prints. She ran faster, hoping there was still a chance. Then, as she approached a thinning forest area, a sight caused her heart to catch in her throat. Spirit was lying there, his body bloodied, its front paw trapped in a steel trap, its dark eyes looking at her. For a moment, time seemed to stop. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Spirit, the cub she had raised, had returned to the wild. But now it was in danger, and she was the only one who could save it. Without hesitation, Margaret rushed over. The snowstorm continued to rage, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let Spirit die in pain. She poured all her strength into freeing the trap, using every tool she could, despite the biting cold winds. Meanwhile, the poachers, those who had set the trap, lurked in the shadows. Margaret realized that if she didn't act immediately, Spirit would have no chance of survival. She hurried to remove the trap from Spirit's paw, despite its struggles in pain. But Spirit didn't attack her. It simply looked at her with grateful eyes. After successfully freeing the trap, Margaret helped Spirit stand, but it seemed too weak to move on its own. The poachers were no longer nearby, but Margaret knew they could return at any moment. With determination and love, she helped Spirit back to the cabin, shielding it from further danger. When they arrived at the warm house, Spirit collapsed onto the wooden floor, panting from exhaustion. Margaret sat beside it, gently stroking its back, comforting it. But inside, an uneasy feeling began to grow. Spirit was no longer the cub she could keep forever. It had once belonged to the forest. And now, she understood that more clearly than ever before. In the following days, Margaret dedicated all her time to caring for Spirit, helping it recover. But deep down, she knew that, no matter how much she loved it, Spirit no longer belonged to the cabin. It belonged to nature, to the wild world it was born into. She understood that she couldn't keep Spirit forever. One early morning, when the snowstorm had ceased and sunlight began to shine through the cabin windows, Margaret saw Spirit standing silently at the cabin door, its eyes lighting up as it looked toward the forest. It didn't look back at her. It simply stood there, as if it had made its decision about where it needed to go. Tears fell quietly down her face as she called Spirit's name one last time. "Go on, my dear. That's where you belong." Spirit looked at her resolutely, then turned and walked into the forest, not once glancing back. Margaret stood there, her hands trembling, but her heart filled with peace. Though heartbroken, she understood that this was the right decision. Spirit didn't belong in artificial life. It belonged to the freedom of nature. Margaret turned back into the cabin, feeling the silence in the space around her. Her story with Spirit would always remain a part of her heart. But she also knew that sometimes, true love is knowing when to let go, allowing the one you love to be free. Time passed relentlessly, and Margaret's life continued. Though now without Spirit, she still cared for Willow and Aspen, the two cubs she had raised from the days when they were weak and needed protection. Under Margaret's loving care, Willow and Aspen had grown stronger and healthier. They were no longer the innocent little ones they once were, but had begun to show their wild instincts. Willow, with her curious nature, would often run around the land, exploring every nook and cranny of the forest near the cabin. Aspen, as always, was the protector, keeping a watchful eye for any lurking dangers, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Margaret felt proud of them, though a gentle sadness lingered in her heart when she remembered Spirit, the cub who had left to find its own path. She continued to teach Willow and Aspen how to live in the natural world, getting accustomed to the dangers, and most importantly, helping them learn how to be independent. But despite her careful preparation, part of her still worried about the day they would leave. As time passed, she knew she couldn't keep them forever. They belonged to the wild, just like Spirit had before. One day, as she stood at the cabin door, admiring the peaceful scenery of this untamed land, a strange sensation overcame her. A light breeze blew through, carrying the scent of the forest and fresh snow. Margaret looked up, and to her surprise, she saw a familiar figure approaching Spirit. But this time, it was not a weak cub, but a grown, strong bear with thick fur and the heart-shaped mark on its chest. Margaret could hardly believe her eyes, but as Spirit emerged from the snowstorm, she realized it was true. What amazed her even more was that Spirit wasn't alone. Behind it, two tiny cubs were following closely. These were Spirit's offspring, the children it had raised in the wild. A female cub and a male cub, both healthy and sharp, just like Margaret had seen when Spirit was still a cub. Margaret's heart ached as she watched this scene unfold. Spirit had returned, not because it needed her, but because it wanted to share an important part of its life. Spirit stood silently, as though watching her, then turned back to the two cubs. Margaret approached, tears welling in her eyes, but not from sorrow, rather from joy. She couldn't contain her emotions, and the tears fell down her cheeks. Spirit hadn't forgotten her. Even though it had returned to the wild, Spirit remembered her, the love she had given, and the days she cared for and protected it. Spirit turned back one more time, its gaze full of affection, before gently leading its cubs into the forest. No words could express the emotions Margaret felt at that moment. She watched the figures of Spirit and the cubs until they disappeared behind the trees. This was the moment she knew that, although Spirit had found its way back, the love she had for it would never fade. It had returned to the wild, but it would forever carry the memories of her, the love they had shared, Spirit's return was not just a beautiful moment in Margaret's life, but a testament to the magical bond between humans and wildlife. Margaret realized that in life, nothing is forever, and sometimes, true love is not about holding on but about letting the one you love be free, to return to where they truly belong. Spirit, with the heart-shaped mark on its chest, would always be a part of her heart, no matter how far it roamed. Margaret's story with the 3 bear cubs became a symbol not only within the animal-loving community, but also in the hearts of millions around the world. Her story was not just about love but about compassion, patience, and sacrifice. Margaret taught everyone that, whether human or animal, we can form meaningful connections and relationships that transcend the boundaries of species. Since then, Margaret's story has been widely shared, inspiring those who believe that kindness can change the world. She became a symbol of compassion, a woman who dedicated her life to caring for and loving wild creatures, helping them find their way. Margaret was not just a woman in the Alaskan wilderness, but someone who made the world a better place, where love and the connection between humans and nature always existed. And though Spirit had gone, the memories of it would remain in her heart, as a legacy of eternal love, a reminder that compassion and connection never fade, no matter the circumstances.